Months of geopolitical upheaval paves the way for a Gaza ceasefire. The ceasefire agreement, though not formalized, in other words, the Israeli cabinet still has to vote on it, between Israel and Hamas follows months of geopolitical upheaval, shifting the dynamics in the region and paving the way for a fragile truce. The deal, brokered in Doha, Qatar, comes after both sides endured heavy losses and pressure from international actors, including President-elect Donald Trump. While the terms of the agreement are similar to those available months ago, significant changes in military, political, and diplomatic conditions ultimately forced both parties to the negotiating table. Many are saying this is the Trump effect. Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu's government gained leverage through a series of military successes, including the killing of Hamas leader Sinwar and strikes that weakened Hezbollah in Lebanon and Iran's defense network. These victories shored up Netanyahu's political base, allowing him to navigate opposition within his coalition and push for the ceasefire. Meanwhile, Hamas faced growing internal pressure from the residents of Gaza, devastated by widespread destruction, displacement, economic collapse, leading to increased calls for an end to the fighting. The ceasefire is structured in phases, beginning with the exchange of hostages held in Gaza for Palestinian prisoners in Israeli jails. The subsequent stages will involve negotiations on a permanent halt to the fighting and plans for Gaza's reconstruction. While the initial agreement marks a step toward ending the 15-month conflict, analysts warn that the deal remains extremely fragile and contentious, particularly among far-right factions within Netanyahu's government who oppose concessions to Hamas. Mainly, Hamas will still be in control of Gaza. Fragile. President-elect Trump's statements about the Middle East added urgency to the negotiation, with his envoy, Steve Witkoff, playing a pivotal role in advancing talks. Trump's return to office has been perceived as a game changer, with his administration signaling strong support for Israel's security priorities, including countering Iran and pursuing normalization with Saudi Arabia. Netanyahu is expected to rely heavily on Trump's team to navigate these regional challenges. Hamas, battered military and politically, has seen its organizational structure decimated, with thousands of fighters killed or detained. The group's miscalculations during the conflict, particularly the hostage-taking strategy, backfired as Israel responded with unprecedented force. Growing dissatisfaction among Gaza's population and appeals for the Palestinian Authority to take over governance have further eroded Hamas's standing, pushing it to agree to the ceasefire. The truce represents a pause in hostilities, but leaves unresolved issues that could reignite tensions. The success of the deal hinges on the delicate balance of implementing its stages, particularly the contentious second phase involving a permanent ceasefire and reconstruction plans, with international and regional actors closely watching. The agreement's durability will depend on sustained pressure, strategic diplomacy, and the willingness of both parties to compromise for long-term stability. Trump and the Israel-Hamas hostage deal are very much intertwined. But one thing that we have to applaud, probably one of the very few times when you see an outgoing president of one party and an incoming president of another party working together for a common good, and that was the ceasefire. Now, will he break from the Biden script to end Hamas's rule of Gaza? That's the big question. The Israel-Hamas hostage deal marks a significant development in this Middle East diplomacy, coming just days before President-elect Donald Trump's inauguration, and also his promise that if the hostages were not released by 20th of January, all hell will be let loose. This agreement, which echoes the release of U.S. hostages during Ronald Reagan's first moments in office, has been attributed to a shift in regional dynamics following Trump's election. While President Biden claimed credit for the deal's framework, it was Trump's threats of all hell to pay that ultimately spurred Hamas and other stakeholders to act. The deal's first phase, as we stated briefly earlier, will secure the release of 33 hostages out of the 94 still held by Hamas. This will include dead and alive individuals, with hopes that the 7 Americans, yes, we still have Americans as hostages, will be freed. I would dare say if Hamas were smart, they'd probably be one of the first ones out the door. However, the deal's cost is steep for Israel, including the release of approximately 1,000 Palestinian prisoners, many of whom are convicted terrorists. This prisoner release, coupled with territorial concessions in Gaza, has drawn criticism from the political right in Netanyahu's own party. And honestly, I kind of question why they have to release people who committed murder and terrorism. We wouldn't do that. Oh, wait a minute. I digress. Biden administration may have done that. Israel's withdrawal from much of Gaza, including the strategic Netzarim corridor, aligns with Biden's long advocated plan, supported by Trump's Middle East envoy, Steve Witkoff, who, remember, Steve Witkoff was instrumental in negotiating the Abraham Accords that were entered during the Trump's first administration. But despite these concessions, Hamas has made significant compromises, such as relinquishing control over supply routes and inspections and dropping its demand for an immediate end to the conflict. This leaves room for Israel to resume military operations if negotiations falter after the first phase. Now, let's look. Why is it that Prime Minister Netanyahu is facing intense scrutiny for accepting this deal? Well, one is because Hamas will stay in power. But for Hamas, it really is, like some of them were saying, because of Trump. That's why Benjamin Netanyahu is actually coming forward and being earnest in his willingness to accept a ceasefire, whether temporary or not. But also, you got to also remember, Hamas, an Iran-funded terrorist group, was emboldened, was supported, was actually probably bolstered by other terrorist organizations such as Hezbollah in Lebanon and Iran herself. And Netanyahu and Israel has stricken a huge blow to Iran with those clear missile attacks, knocking out air defenses of Iran. Also, the absolute beatdown of Hezbollah in Lebanon, which we had that ceasefire just about a month ago, give or take. And that is huge. So now the next critical question will be how President-elect Trump responds if Hamas refuses to disarm or agree to a non-terrorist government in Gaza. Trump's statement suggests he supports Israel's effort to ensure Gaza does not remain a terrorist stronghold, aligning with his prospective administration's hardline stance on Hamas. His willingness to back Israel's military actions, if needed, will shape this region's future. Now, remember, Trump is also the first president to acknowledge that Jerusalem is the capital of Israel and moved our embassy to Jerusalem. Ultimately, this deal reflects a departure from the Biden administration's approach, signaling a return to a more assertive U.S. foreign policy under Trump. If Trump remains steadfast in supporting Israel's objectives, the agreement could mark the beginning of a significant shift in regional power dynamics, ending Hamas's control of Gaza, perhaps freeing the poor people of Gaza of their totalitarian rule, and signaling the end of a perceived appeasement in the Middle East. And as Israeli Prime Minister Netanyahu postpones the approval of a Gaza ceasefire deal, he has accused Hamas of creating a last-minute crisis by reneging on agreed terms. His office stated that Hamas sought to gain additional concessions, particularly concerning Israel's veto power over which Palestinian prisoners convicted of murder would be released in exchange for hostages. This disagreement has delayed the Israeli cabinet's decision. adding further complexity to these high-stakes negotiations. However, one thing's for sure, time's a ticking, people. President Trump is coming in. Come the 20th, we are less than 3 days out. And whether Biden doesn't like to admit it. When asked at his very last, and one of the very few press conferences he had, that a reporter goes, does Trump get the credit for this ceasefire? He turned around and goes, are you joking? Is that a joke? Well, let's face it, the Trump factor is in. When you have a soon-to-be president who was once president, by the way, remember that. Everybody says they're afraid of a Trump administration. We already had one. But now he knows what he's doing. But the bottom line is that he has stated unequivocally, if Hamas doesn't release those hostages, all hell will break loose. And you know what? Hellfire will be coming down. And it is time. We need peace in the Middle East. We also need to support our greatest ally in the Middle East. And through this ceasefire, then more peace accords can be brought in. I am Alina Gonzalez Dockery. Thank you for tuning in for another episode of Purple Politics. And next week, we will be talking about everything inauguration, as well as all the executive orders that I'm sure are going to be coming in the moment he walks back into that Oval Office. I want to wish you all a very safe, wonderful weekend, and I'll see you back next week. Good night.
This has been a Now Media Networks feature presentation. All rights reserved.